Thank you so much, Kaylee. Let me welcome Mary O'Connell, our 3PL expert calling in from St. Louis, Missouri. What's going on, Mary? How are you today? Oh, she's muted a little bit.
Oh, no.
Oh, no, there she is. She's back.
There we go.
She's back. Hey, what's going on, Mary? Let's talk about what's going on with the chassis shortage in the Midwest.
Yeah, so today on the episode of Tech Call, we do a nice little market deep dive, including some container shortages and some chassis shortages that are happening at Midwestern rail yards. So pretty much in Chicago, mostly that's where the biggest issues are. They don't have enough chassis to unload the rail cars because they're trying to keep the West Coast, yes, the ports of LA and Long Beach, they're trying to prevent the backup that we saw at the beginning of the year. So they're tossing everything they can on the rail. And now the dwell times in Chicago and Kansas City and Memphis are starting to creep up, because there aren't enough chassis to unload everything coming off the rail. So now they're having to resort to stacking. Shippers are getting charged the daily dwell time fee, kind of like what they were trying to impose on the West Coast, but the rail companies actually did it and are charging shippers days that containers are sitting there, and drivers are just having a real kind of difficult time to come in with empties, and it's a bad situation.
Everybody's saying, you know what, let's take the problem at the ports and push it somewhere else, right? And just because you decide that intermodal is going to be that relief valve for port congestion doesn't mean that it actually is the relief valve, because then it ends up building up in those inland ports. And if you don't have the equipment, you don't have the drivers to take care of it, then you're just postponing the problem a little bit further down the link in the supply chain, right? And so we know that it's not for lack of trying. We know that there's still a ton of effort to try and get these unloaded. But what can people do more to kind of alleviate the solution? Is there one to find a solution for this?
So I think it's kind of a combination of problems. So basically, the shippers are obviously, they've ordered everything. Mostly retail shippers have ordered as much as they can, and now consumers aren't buying as much, which is, we all very well know. But the biggest issue is that typically when something would come in and shippers didn't have an immediate place for it, they'd make space in a warehouse for it. But due to the volume that's sitting, that's waiting to be pulled out of the rail yard, the inability to access decent warehouse space, the prime cost of warehouse spaces, in some cases it's almost cheaper just eat the cost of the dwell times than try to find additional warehouse capacity for it. So it's kind of a perfect storm that we've all talked about over the last year and a half, that is actually all kind of coming to a head now. We solved the problem on the West Coast, but now it's affecting inland areas as well. And I think really just getting the stuff out of the rail yard as fast as they can, even if it means that you have to park it in the parking lot of a warehouse and take up a space for something. It's worth it to just not get those dwell times and actually allow the goods to flow freely again, because most of those inland ports and most of those rail yards, they have stopped the cherry picking rule where you can't just go in and pick whatever one you want. No, you got to take the container that's on top, and you got to take it no matter what. They're not doing any of that. They're just it's stacked up. You got to take what's on top.
Yeah, it's an interesting situation that's there, because if you take that and you park that in your parking lot, you're eating up chassis space, but you don't have the space to unload the container, and then when you bring it back, you've got the dwell times that are there. How much of this, is there a sense as to how much of this is caused by the different possible catalysts, right? I mean, there's not 5 more trains coming into Chicago than there used to be, or they're not twice as long. Is it more that there's a slowdown in accepting these things, and therefore the fines may actually work to force these BCOs to come in, or the shippers to come and get their freight? Or is it a situation where they just have to pack them on chassis, and we're eating up actual chassis?
I think it's a combination of a few things. I'm no real expert by any means,
Right.
but what I do know is that shippers aren't picking up their stuff as often. We know that it's a little harder to find capacity in certain areas, but also it's easier in others. So shippers aren't picking up their stuff as often, or as with such demand and urgency. They're not picking that up. And then also, like you said, there's nowhere for it to go. So that container just has to sit on a chassis in their yard. So those are getting tied up and not necessarily being brought back to the rail yard as quickly. So that way stuff can get unloaded. So the volumes aren't as high as there's no more frequency of trucks coming, and they're not 3 times as long, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
It's just, things aren't getting picked up. So things are sitting there and they're just left kind of going, well, what do we do now? Because a lot of those rail yards aren't designed to hold 2 to 3 to 4 days worth of shipments that need to be picked up. Like there's one 10 minutes away from my house, and I drive past it and I was like, there's not room to store things here. So,
No.
I mean, that's just one rail yard out of a bunch. But so yeah, I definitely think that, if you ordered something, you got to go pick it up. Like the FedEx will return your parcel package 5 days after it gets held at a FedEx store. I don't think that's possible on a rail yard, but basically just go in and pick it up.
Demurrage is possible.
Yeah, but they're always going to send it back on a train back to the port
Yeah,
and say,
they're
what,
not
take it
doing
back
that.
across the Pacific Ocean. Let's talk a little bit about what if maybe you're a 3PL in this situation and you're trying to find the capacity and you're trying to work around this chassis shortage. What can you do maybe as you're a broker and trying to figure out like, okay, let me source this capacity to go in and pick this up? Are there any strategies you can employ to maybe better source capacity to help move these loads right now?
Absolutely. So a 3PL and a freight broker, they're supposed to be a partner for the shipper and the carrier. Like they are the true intermediary. They should be doing something that's going to benefit the shipper and the carrier. And while your shipper right now doesn't have capacity at any of their receiving centers, or maybe move it to a receiving center that isn't. So if, for example, if it's supposed to go to a receiving center in Northern Illinois, but the space in Omaha, Nebraska, like there's space in Nebraska, see if it's possible just to get it picked up and move it to Nebraska. It's not ideal, but at least it's out of the rail yard. You're not facing some of those dwell charges. Also, see if there's some extra warehouse space. If you know that you have, if you're a 3PL that has two customers in Northern Illinois, and one of them has some extra space and the other one's just maxed out, has containers parked in the parking lot, see if the other one could maybe hold a container or two, work out some kind of storage charge that the second customer would charge the 3PL and the 3PL could charge back to the first customer. So that way, just kind of get creative with a space that you can that you can hold stuff and move stuff, and really just kind of serve as a solution maker for your customer. Like solve those problems and see what there is to see and just get creative with it.
Yeah, there are flexible warehousing firms that are out there. I don't know how full they are right now. And there's also people, I get tweets and texts all the time. They're selling containers. You can buy containers pretty cheap right now.
And not for a tiny home.
Not for a tiny home, but maybe a tiny home for the Legos you bought or something. I don't know.
All right, Mary, thank you for joining us today. Go check out Check Call this afternoon and subscribe to her newsletter if you haven't just quite yet. Right now, we're going to take another quick break. We'll be back with more FreightWaves Now in just a few minutes.